president of Taiwan, Lai Ching-te, he gave a speech a couple of days ago. Today is May 22nd. He gave a major speech on May the 20th, which I believe marked 1 year in office since his January 2024 election, and then he inaugurated in May. Before that, this is something that you mentioned on Pascal's show in April the 26th, I believe. There was a major rally in Taiwan against what sounds like some very serious political machinations or some skullduggery, some very strange things going on in Taiwan. Can you give us a little context? What's going on, and what is President Lai up to, and why is nobody in the Western media talking about Taiwan right now?
Well, certainly people understand that the DPP government has been held as the model democracy value partner by both the Democratic President Biden and the now Republican President Trump. So in that overall gesture, people swept a lot of things under the rug. For example, during the 1 year anniversary or prior to the 1 year anniversary, if you were on the ground in Taiwan, you would see a rapid deterioration of the Taiwan democracy. There were three very important telltale signs. One is at the tail end of the Tsai Ing-wen government, they passed a lot of laws that would be constituted as bill of attainder, is targeted to the opposition party. When Lai Ching-te assumed his office in May 20th last year, the law was implemented to the nth degree, and then more recently, the DPP government has waged something they call the general recall, 大罢免. Typically, you would recall 1 or 2 legislators, which are senators in our system, if they really didn't do a good job. So there were a couple of senators being recalled by their constituents. But this is a very entirely different beast because the ruling party, DPP, decided to do a great general recall of over 30, 40 KMT and another party's legislators. In other words, instead of dismissing the Congress and have a general re-election, if you truly believe that the current legislators are not representing the real sense of the people, then you can dismiss the Congress, have a general re-election. But instead, they use what they call 大罢免, the general recall, to target over 35 different legislators of the opposition party. But the third movement on top of that general recall, which is a political move, the third thing was they decided to use judicial power to target people who led the counter recall, meaning KMT recalling the ruling party DPP legislators. So the counter recalls leaders were being investigated by the judicial branch, and to date, there were nearly 10 of them being incarcerated incommunicado, meaning they were jailed without communication with the outside world. So you could see that there were a lot of things that does not fit the bill of a model democracy. And I forgot to mention another really big one. That is, they have jailed the chairman of the opposition party, the People's Party, for over 6 months by now. So in that sense, you can see there is a deterioration of the overall democratic system. It's hurting the balance of power or separation of power because the administrative branch is using its power to influence the judicial branch. Then it's also impacting the balance within the legislative branch, which has a minority DPP and a majority opposition composition at this time. So what we're seeing on the ground is Taiwan's so-called democracy is deteriorating to the nth degree, and therefore April 26, people walked on the streets, and that is a place that we typically hold our political rallies. And there were more than 250,000 people attending that very large opposition party waged mass rally, but you don't hear any major Western media reporting that at all, because they still allow the DPP to claim that they are the model democracy, they are the value partner, they are the human rights protector. And to date, the May 20th speech, as you mentioned earlier, Lai Ching-te still walked that path and said that the 1 year anniversary marked a lot of fantastic achievements by the DPP. But I think it's important to know that when we talk about truth, it has to be the truth, nothing but the truth, and the whole truth. He didn't tell the whole truth. In his words, this is still a model democracy that's working, but he didn't mention any of the people who are incarcerated, incommunicado, and all the massive rallies against what he's trying to do in using political force to change the balance in our Congress. So it is not the truth, the whole truth, and nothing about the truth is not being protected at all.
I would encourage people listening to this to read. It's available in English online to read the speech that President Lai gave on May the 20th. It's festooned with celebrations of democracy. Taiwan is a model democracy. And at the end, he concludes, right before the end, he concludes with almost a profession of fealty to the United States. And Taiwan will be working in partnership with the United States. And it sounds to me, knowing from you, thanks to you, knowing what's been going on inside of Taiwan, it sounds to me like very, very intense propaganda. Here's someone who has been propped up in the Western media as a champion of democracy. Mm-hmm. He used the word democracy. I lost count of how many times in his speech he said the word democracy. And yet, as you just mentioned, there's someone who's been imprisoned in a political prisoner, I think we could call him, for 6 months incommunicado without a trial. And I believe you're referring to Ko Wan-je, who was the...
Yeah. Let me just make it clear to everyone. Ko Wan-je was first arrested for alleged misuse of campaign funds, but then he was held for at least 4 months without trial before he was finally charged and sent to the real court. But our system allows you to continue hold people incarcerated even after he is being tried in court. So to date, he has not been released. He was not even able to see his father in his deathbed. Actually, they did give him a couple of hours to see his father in his deathbed, and his father has now passed away. So that's Ko Wan-je, the chairperson who ran against Lai Ching-te in the last presidential election. In fact, he had garnered over 20% of the vote. So if you look at what Lai Ching-te has done in the first year of his time in office, he managed to ring in all the opposition members within his parties. The ones who did not work in his fraction are being charged. At least 3 of them have been charged. So they no longer would have a political career. At least they would not challenge him in the next presidential election. Then he enlarged his circle of opposition by getting Ko Wan-je, who is the chairperson who ran against him in the presidential election, to be a criminal of misusing campaign funds and also embezzlements and other sorts, because Ko Wan-je was the mayor of Taipei. So they actually managed to charge him for 3 things. Now he's being tried, but he's not released. He's still incarcerated. Then for the young people who led the recall of the DPP senators, they were sometimes KMT local party cadres. These people are being incarcerated incommunicado without being charged. And they will be held for 2 months at a time. And that would give them plenty of time to push the DPP general recall without having their senators being recalled by the opposition. So there are a very, very large movement by using the judicial branch against political oppositions. And that is what Lai Ching-te didn't say in his May 20th address.
None of this sounds like democracy to me. This is quite frightening to me. So you've got the Kuomintang, which is favoring stable relations with the People's Republic of China right next door, and then you've got a very, very aggressive, progressive party that is, it seems to me, attempting to move Taiwan into the orbit of not so much the United States, but Washington, whatever Washington wants in East Asia. Can you explain a little bit about why this is happening and what's going on inside of Taiwan? This recall sounds more like a purge to me, and the counter recall sounds more like an attempt to stop the purge, and the people who have been purged are now being put into prison to stop them from resisting what is this purge. Can you explain what brought all this about?
Okay, let me just quickly address the purging part. The recall is a very unique system. You need to have 1% of the people in the constituents signing a petition for the first phase. And then you need 10% of the people signing a petition in order to do a general election for the constituents. So the ones who are leading the petition are now being put in jail. So whatever they're trying to do probably will not be put through a general election or general vote by the real people of the constituents. And that is a way to stop KMT from waging a counter recall. So let me go back to the 3 moving parts. You have mentioned 3 moving parts. You have DPP, who used to be an opposition party, and in fact, it was not a party until the 1990s. And then you have KMT and mainland China's Communist Party. These 2 parties have a very long history of understanding, fighting each other. So KMT was not always a pro sort of stability and peace party. In fact, in 1949, when KMT lost its war, the civil war in mainland China, it moved to Taiwan, and the initial phase still has a very strong position of trying to fight the civil war against the Communist Party. And at the time, the United States have decided to abandon the Chiang Kai-shek government at one point and decided to recognize it at the time of the Korean War, because Taiwan would be a very important base for the Korean War, and Taiwan was an even more important base during the Vietnam War. So it is very clear that during the Korean War and the Vietnam War, Taiwan was used as a U.S. military and other bases against the then Soviet Union and the PRC. So what we can see is the United States have moved its position. It started not recognizing the Chiang Kai-shek government, and then recognizing the Chiang Kai-shek government to wage the counteroffensives against USSR and PRC. And then in 1970s, and it is very important for people to remember the time, because it is at the time of the two oil crisis. In the 1970s, the United States all of a sudden also changed its overall grand strategy vis-a-vis Soviet Union and PRC, and that is what we call the Kissinger Doctrine. They started not recognizing Taiwan in the United Nations because ROC, the government in Taiwan, was the founding member of the United Nations and was holding the seat in the Security Council. But all of a sudden in 1972, Taiwan was ousted from the United Nations. And then in 1979, they decided to sever the diplomatic relationship with the government in Taiwan, the ROC government, and use another tactic to normalize, quote unquote, their relationship with PRC in Beijing, so that they can use Beijing as a way to combat or to balance the power of USSR. So the long story short is Taiwan, in terms of the parties and the relationship with PRC, has always been a part of the US game. And KMT, as a very long-term ruling party, starting from 1911, so now it's over 100 years old, had a very long history of understanding mainland China, understanding People's Republic of China, understanding the Communist Party in China. So it doesn't have a lot of illusion, but it has a very long history in managing peace. And that is something I'd like to say. I am 66 years old. I was born in 1958. 1958 was the last time regimes, governments, armies across the Taiwan Straits have a hard, direct confrontation in Jinmen. Jinmen actually received over 400,000 bombshells in 1958. And that is really important to remember, because since then, we have, even though we're still officially in a civil war, the two governments have not ceased to claim that they have the only representation of the entire China, but the two governments did not engage in any hot war, the kinds of combat you see in Ukraine or in Israel. There was no hard combat since 1958. So while we were officially or technically at war, we actually managed peace. And the time that KMT ruled was the longest time of managing that peace. In addition to that, 2005, Lian Zhan, the then KMT chairperson, led a delegation, I was part of the delegation, to Beijing, officially engaged the Communist Party and said, let's start a conversation to discuss our peaceful co-development going forward. So 2005 opened an era of negotiation, of moving towards an eventual peace. And Ma Ying-jeou's 8 years saw the results of that. There were over 22 ministry-to-ministry meetings and over 30 agreements across the governments across Taiwan Straits. So we were able to manage peace, and most of that, actually all of that, was done under the KMT regime. And what I'm trying to say is KMT didn't have an illusion that we didn't have a confrontation. It didn't have an illusion that we didn't have a war, because it managed that war. But KMT also saw a possibility of peace, starting from 2005, Lian Zhan, and 2008 to 16, Ma Ying-jeou. We saw the ability to open door and have ministry-to-ministry negotiation across Taiwan Straits without any foreign intervention. So now, when Lai Ching-te and Tsai Ing-wen came into the office, because of their extreme Taiwan independence position, they needed the support of Japan and the United States. So they keep saying that we really, really need Japan to support Taiwan. We really, really need US to support Taiwan. And at the time, Abe, the prime minister in Japan, as well as Biden in the United States, have said that they will support Taiwan, and their support is solid as rock. So that's interpreted as a support, a backstop of a Taiwan independence movement. And now we're seeing it deteriorating to an nth degree.
What you're saying here is something that is almost never mentioned in the American media or in Japan, for that matter. People here in Japan talk very much about Taiwan. It's a very solid conservative position to express support for Taiwan. But I often wonder whether people who claim to support Taiwan know what that means concretely. What it will eventuate in, I think, is a hot war with the People's Republic of China, which would lead perhaps to the annihilation of Taiwan. It would certainly cause tremendous damage and suffering in Taiwan and in Japan. And it would seem to me that if such a war were to break out, then Taiwan really would become the next Ukraine, in the sense that the Americans would not send troops. We would watch on television as people in a foreign country died, while politicians in Washington and perhaps also in Tokyo claimed to support, for the sake of freedom and democracy, these people who were dying in the streets of a distant foreign country. It seems that Taiwan remains a pawn in Washington politics, and now it's become a pawn in American politics. The people inside of Taiwan must have a very different view of all this. I'm sure they don't want to be a pawn of anyone. I'm sure they have their own ideas. And one thing I also wanted to discuss, and just reading your background a bit, I've long been interested in the pro-life movement inside of Taiwan and in some of these moral issues that are going on inside of Taiwan. The LGBT movement, I've seen President Lai and then formerly President Tsai have been at these LGBT parades. And I know that there are many people in Taiwan who don't agree with this and who have been trying to stop this. Perhaps you could call it a second kind of civil war, a culture war inside of Taiwan. This never gets mentioned in the American media. People think that Taiwan is this democratic paradise, but there are a lot of things going on inside of Taiwan that conservatives in the United States or in Japan would agree with the KMT much more than they would agree with the DPP, the Progressive Party, on social issues. Can you bring up a little bit of what's going on inside of Japan socially, inside of Taiwan socially, and what a war with China would really mean for Taiwan?
I'm glad you mentioned this, but I think it's really, really clear that when the United States is moving in the woke culture and the DEI movement, Taiwan followed suit. So Tsai Ing-wen and Lai Ching-te both followed really, really closely the DEI movement. In fact, a lot of the spokesperson or a lot of the rallies were held in Taipei. So Taipei is not only touted as a model democracy, but also, held as a value partner, and the value, quote unquote, is the DEI culture, the woke culture. So once we understand the sort of underpinning, then it's really, really clear that why both Tsai Ing-wen and Lai Ching-te got so much support, especially from the Democratic Party, so much so that even Pelosi came to Taiwan with no tangible agenda. I just want to share with people a little bit. When Pelosi came to Taiwan, everybody understood that was the sort of big, major military escalation across Taiwan Straits, because China reacted really badly. The visit of Pelosi, when she landed at about 10-ish at night, and until she left Taiwan, she actually didn't meet anyone very significant. In fact, she had so much time to kill. She went to a couple of parks which celebrated or commemorated the human rights of Taiwan without meeting any human rights leaders, not even the LGBT leaders in Taiwan. So you can see that there is a very big playbook, and it's a show being put on stage for its significance or whatever, for her position. But there were nothing tangible, actually none, because I was trying to figure out whom she met, whether she would give them real strong support. So we have some people following her path, and she had so much time that she went to a very insignificant park around the sort of Taipei County, and she didn't meet anyone there. So let me go back to how people really feel. I think initially when war was still so far away, people didn't really take it very seriously. But when now we see what happened to Ukraine, especially how Trump tried to just get out of Ukraine, having Ukraine to agree to all American conditions, terms and conditions, without promising what Ukraine wanted, without even recognizing that the Ukraine situation was initially promoted by the Democratic leaders, starting from Clinton. They kept talking about Georgia and Ukraine having a path going into NATO, and that's way back when. It's when Soviet Union simply just ended, and it was at the time when Warsaw Pact was supposed to also bring in the end of the NATO. So you could see what happened to Ukraine and Georgia, and then people can see what will happen to Taiwan. It is now more clear than ever, especially after they tried to get out of Ukraine. Recently, Rubio said to everyone, I think it's just a day or two ago, he mentioned that U.S. has to get out of Europe and has to get out of Middle East to manage a new Middle East balance so that it can focus its attention to the West Pacific. So now it's very, very clear that there is a progression. Ukraine first, Israel second, and now it's time for them to focus in the West Pacific. And here we have three major U.S. theses. One is Taiwan is a major democracy against a totalitarian PRC. Second is Taiwan is a value partner, but also it is also holding Taiwan Strait, which is the lifeline from the Middle East to Japan. And now a tangent of that second thesis is Taiwan is where TSMC is or NVIDIA will be. So chips and AI will be very important to the entire world. So whatever happens to Taiwan, the world must pay attention. And by that saying, the world must come to defend, right? And then the last one, the third thesis is US and the rest of the countries should have and will have freedom of passage in the South Pacific, as well as the South China Sea. So if we look at the three major scenarios that US painted, they would put Taiwan right in the forefront of any potential confrontation in the first island chain and also the entire Indo-Pacific. So I think people in Taiwan are gradually realizing that if there were any select field of confrontation, if someone wants to pick a theater for a confrontation, Taiwan, the Philippines are probably the number 1, 2. Before, people were talking about India and China because they had a very long border conflicts. But after India and Pakistan, probably it wouldn't happen because the demonstration of force is so clear. So now it goes back to Taiwan, Philippines, and perhaps somewhere around Okinawa. We are at the forefront of a potential conflict. And if the conflict happens, PRC has demonstrated its ability and its modern build-out of People's Liberation Army, especially in April this year. So there were 3 or 4 military exercises. I don't think they're exercises. Even the US generals calling them rehearsals. So you're now seeing how, if and when there will be a war, the war will be managed in such a way that they demonstrate to you what the battlefield situation is and how they would go about it 1, 2, and 3. So more people are now thinking about a real tangible confrontation happening on Taiwan, which is an extremely small island. Therefore, we have actually a problem of getting enough Army, Navy, Air Force recruits. The cadets are not reporting. This year, we have about 30% of the cadets wanting to join the Army, Navy, or Air Force in September. We also have a large problem of people not wanting to serve in their military service, which is compulsory. Usually, in the last couple of years, we have reduced the compulsory military service to 4 months, basically to allow every man, no woman, every man to at least know how to operate basic weaponry. But with the US support and US pushing, we are now adding the 4 months back to 1 year. So all young men will now be subject to a 1-year military service, and a lot of them are trying to avoid going back into the 1-year military service. That is because war is now more tangible. It is closer, more pacing. It's more likely that would happen. So when you say how people feel about it, I think it used to be a very distant scenario. Like I said, I'm 66 years old. We didn't have war between Taiwan Straits for 66 years. So that's a very distant scenario. But now it seems to be coming our way. And then we changed our law locally so that if you are a US citizen, you can serve in the government, which is not allowed. You can't even go into the Congress as a foreign national. So we changed the law so that foreign nationals, for example, if you're a US citizen, you can go into our government and hold positions, be advisors or more stable of office. And then we have a lot more military advisors coming onto Taiwan. That's the first time ever since 1979, because during the severance of the diplomatic relation and the normalization with PRC, US promised 3 things: sever the relationship with Taiwan diplomatic officially, remove all the military personnel from Taiwan. They used to have a very large base in Taipei and another very large naval base in Zuoying. So remove the military personnel from Taiwan. And then the third one is to stop operating the Joint Defense Treaty. We actually had a very strong Joint Defense Treaty, just like US and Japan has. So all 3 was supposed to stop in operation in 1979, and now we're seeing them coming back.
This is quite alarming, and I don't know that anyone in major American media outlets is reporting this, at least not to the level that it should be. So what you're talking about is not just a pre-2022 Ukraine situation, but almost a Vietnam situation where now you have the advisors coming in. That's how it begins. And then there will be some incident, perhaps it will be planned or unplanned, and there will be Americans who will be killed or involved in some way. And then you will begin to have troops coming in and full-scale military operations. As you said, even the so-called exercises are being treated as rehearsals. These are attempts to war game their way into an actual war, it would seem, in Taiwan. And I think it's very significant that the people in Taiwan have changed their view of the geopolitical map now. That it used to be that the reporting at least in Japan, was that people in Taiwan are ready. We know that we're all fighting for freedom and democracy, and the people are very tough and they're ready to die on the cliffs fighting the communists and so forth. But to hear you report it, and to hear the 250,000+ people who are in the streets of Taipei, they are not satisfied with the level of democracy in Taiwan, and they're not prepared to die for an American game. What sounds to me that's happening, it's not just Ukraine or Vietnam happening again. It's an extension of the old Western mercantilism, imperialism. I remember in the run-up to the 2024 election, one of the candidates, Vivek Ramaswamy, gave a speech in a very Nixonian vein saying that we had to protect Taiwan until we could make the chips in America, and then we could cut Taiwan loose. I was quite shocked by that. I don't know if it was covered in Taiwan, but this is basically saying we don't care about the people of Taiwan. We just want what they can give us, and when we can get it for ourselves, then we don't care about them. That seems to be the real position of Washington, and it seems that people in Taiwan have now understood that. So what happens going forward? I mean, it seems like the Taiwanese are, at least the Lai administration is preparing to buy even more military equipment from the Americans, let advisors in from Washington, play the empire game, no matter how many Taiwanese people are killed. What happens next in Taiwan now that democracy seems not to be functioning? It seems like a very dangerous time domestically as well.
It is indeed very dangerous. Let me give you 3 more data points. Usually in June 18th, there is a very large congregation to celebrate the cultural connection between Taiwan and Fujian. And this year, the government has earmarked that and saying that all the locals, including the local temples or local leaders going into there, could be subject to espionage influences.
Just for traveling to Fujian.
To Fujian. And because the theory is once you go to Fujian, you may be subject to any kind of influence, and you may bring those influence back to Taiwan and make our defense or our resolve to defend ourselves weaker. The second data point is the Minister of Education. We have a lot of cross-strait educational exchanges. Actually, at one point in Ma Ying-jeou's time, we opened our colleges, universities, because we have access capacity to mainland China students. So there were a lot of mainland Chinese students who would actually come to Taiwan for 1 year, 2 year, or 4 year education. Now, our Minister of Education recently claimed that they not only will not endorse, they actually will not encourage any cross-strait educational exchanges, not for elementary school children, junior high school children, or high school children, because in their views, once you engage in this kind of education exchanges, you will be, once again, affected, influenced by mainland China. That's the second point. And the third point is we have quite a few sort of local rituals, very local cultural rituals. Now, even the local rituals are being attacked or sometimes being warned by the current DPP government as having celebrated the Chinese gods or Chinese goddesses. So you can see that overall, the attempt to sever Taiwan's relationship with mainland China is not only in the political arena, but also in cultural and social arena overall. And that is to build an entirely different and unique Taiwan identity. This Taiwan identity will follow the Taiwan independence theory that since we are not Chinese and we don't have a long relationship with Chinese, then the Taiwanness, quote unquote, should have the right to do self-determination. And we should have the right to vote for our own future. And once we self-determine to be a different nation, then we should have, quote unquote, right to join the United Nations. So these are all a whole series of theories. But if you were anyone who worked in the United Nations would know that this will not happen because U.S. has not supported Taiwan since 1972. Even with all the words and all the so-called Taiwan Support Act in the U.S. Congress, United States to this date have not said they will come back and recognize Taiwan. Right. They have not done something that's entirely within the U.S. wherewithal. If they wanted to do it, they can do it, and they have not done it, and they have not done it in the UN. And at the same time, PRC has strong relationship with over 183 countries, and in each and every one of their relationship, there has always been a very clear clause that PRC is the only representation of China, and that was the 1972 2758 resolution. So if you follow the Lai Ching-de's thesis, he may have a chance of building an entire different people, the Taiwan people, which has a lot to do with the South Island language groups, with the South Islanders, and then use that for a right to self-determination to participate in the UN. But if you look at political realities, there's no such possibility. So let's go back to how many people supported Lai Ching-de. 70% of the people voted in the last election. 40% voted for his party. So that's 28% in total. In the most recent public opinion polls, 1 year after his inauguration, the ones who didn't vote for him has an extremely low approval rate, less than 20%, starting from less than 10 to less than 20, because there are quite a few different polls. Less than 10 to 20% of the people who didn't vote for him approve for what he's doing in terms of being a leader and what he's doing in cross-strait relationship. And that's his biggest disapproval. Then the ones approving or voted for him has about half of the people still support him. So you can see Lai Ching-de is actually of an extreme minority position, and that is why I believe he's doing extreme political measures to secure and cement his position.